What was life like for the typical U.S. consumer during the Roaring '20s? And did the way businesses catered to their demands set the stage, at least in part, for a violent and greedy end of the decade? Welcome to Decades of Heistery, where we cover safecrackers and bank heists from 1926 up until U.S. involvement in World War II. It is October 1926, and autumn revealed some cracks in the American economy. College and pro football was on many people's minds, and by now, pay-later consumption schemes helped fans and non-fans alike buy. It is the Roaring '20s after all, and what could go wrong? Football season was prominent, as we see in comics and advertisements in the Daily Kennebec Journal. However, being the Roaring '20s and past the halfway mark of the decade, we know that negative issues were well along the way to emerging, including cultural and economic ones. An advertisement that ran throughout the month in the Alaska Daily Empire was for the First National Bank in Juneau, Alaska. It touted security against fires, but also robberies. Surely this is a sign that robberies were becoming ubiquitous. And while robberies were the obvious and very scary reality, something more passive and definitely not violent was showing cracks in the economy. The Indianapolis Times has a great looking advertisement for the Kay Jewelry Company in Washington, D.C. I'm not sure if this is what became Kay Jewelers of today. Either way, it ran a special sale on an Illinois Sterling pocket watch. Given away, or included with purchase, was a choice of a chain to hold the watch and a small knife that went along with the chain for what amounted to a complete EDC, everyday carry setup, 1920s style. The kicker, however, was that it cost $32.50, which must have been pretty pricey back then. Luckily, they offered $1 down and $1 per week payment plans. Yes, payment plans were born years before today's nothing down, pay later schemes. This is a divergence from buying what one could pay for then and there. A modern approach? Yes, but potentially leading to overspending too? Also yes. More cracks showing in the greater 1926 economy, as we've noted in previous episodes. Connecticut's New Britain Herald ran an advertisement for a clothing store called The Famous Store. Throughout the ad, it suggests that customers, quote, use our friendly credit, end quote, and apparently pay, quote, a little each week, end quote. Also, families could look their best. Just say, quote, charge it, end quote, and you were good to go. Until you couldn't pay. Then what? Well, maybe you could fall back on the concept of health is wealth, courtesy of Kellogg's cereals. Follow-ups. What would the '20s be without a little anarchy? Or in this case, some labor or the battle for workers' rights. Enter the Sacco and Vanzetti saga. We know it well today, so it should come as no surprise that after covering their story in numerous previous episodes, due to the connection with bank robber Celestino Madeiros, we come across yet more additions. In this case, 6 more additions in October. 5 of those 6 additions are from the appropriately named newspaper, The Daily Worker. Another follow-up comes from Texas, covered in 3 editions by the Brownsville Herald, and adds to the Irving, Texas heist we noted in the September 1926 Part 2 episode. Or is it actually a follow-up? What the story probably demonstrates best is that there were loosely affiliated robbers who blended across gangs or robbery combines. Think of a family tree with numerous branches or a spider web. But first, we follow up on what was originally a September quick hitter. Recall the September 30th high noon heist of the First National Bank of New Rockford, North Dakota, when 3 unmasked bandits scored between $50,000 and $60,000. They lit out of town in a 1925 Buick sedan with a posse not too far behind. It was considered the biggest bank robbery on record in North Dakota, according to Secretary W.C. McFadden of the North Dakota Bankers Association. Shortly thereafter, updated the amount to $90,000. The posse, comprised as always of law enforcement, town officials, and area businessmen, tracked the Buick about 5 miles south of Tolna, North Dakota, east of New Rockford, and then they lost them. The posse gave up and returned to New Rockford. An additional story just below the main review of the robbery was about the description fitting that of a Norris Forrest, alleged lone wolf burglar of Minot, North Dakota, and included information about 2 of 6 fugitives who'd recently broken out of jail in Minot. Aside from matching Forrest, descriptions fit escapees Harry Scott and Robert Johnstone. One clue connecting Forrest was that he'd been having eye problems lately, and sure enough, one of the New Rockford robbers had been wearing colored eyeglasses. So this is a clue but not evidence, or maybe we can consider it circumstantial evidence. A $300 reward was put on Forrest's head, as he'd already escaped jail twice, including recently, or most recently, the Ward County Jail. However, according to the next day's Bismarck Tribune, bank officials were unable to identify pictures of Norris Forrest. Photographs were shown to cashier Lynn Schwobel and Vice President Martin Case, but there was no match. So we don't know if the lone wolf was involved or frankly who perpetrated the heist at this point. But it is fun to say lone wolf. We introduced Celestino Madeiros in the July 1926 Part 2 episode, and then revisited him in August. To review, Madeiros was originally sentenced to die by the electric chair on September 15, 1926. He, along with Alfred W. Bedard and James F. Weeks, whose real surname was Croft, had attempted to rob the Wrentham National Bank in Wrentham, Massachusetts. During the heist, Madeiros shot and killed elderly cashier James A. Carpenter. While Bedard and Weeks were sentenced to life in prison, Madeiros received the death penalty. Madeiros appealed the death penalty, hoping for life in prison instead, but it was denied. While in a Dedham, Massachusetts prison, Madeiros wrote a long statement that absolved famous anarchists Sacco and Vanzetti of guilt in the Braintree, Massachusetts payroll murders. Madeiros claimed that he and others comprising a Providence, Rhode Island gang were actually guilty. Now, we can look at the Madeiros angle from the daily workers' perspective, knowing that their actual goal was the release of Sacco and Vanzetti, and thereby a justification for their pro-labor with a capital L position. Author J. Lewis Engdahl penned 5 massive page 2 stories in a series in less than a month's editions. Story 1 was titled Madeiros Tells Truth That Blasts Frame-Up of Sacco and Vanzetti. The opening salvo essentially positioned Sacco and Vanzetti as victims of the U.S. government that targeted them instead of deporting them or trying them for labor-related crimes due to their working-class principles. Instead, they were framed with the April 15, 1920 payroll murders. The Daily Worker stated that the case, instead of focusing on Sacco and Vanzetti's labor principles, became way more focused on details about the murder weapons and cars used. Based on Celestino Madeiros' affidavit, Sacco and Vanzetti lawyer William G. Thompson paid a visit to Dedham, Massachusetts back in November of 1925. Apparently, Madeiros' confession arrived to an amulet fabri of the Sacco and Vanzetti Defense Committee, and it said, quote, "I hereby confess to being in the South Braintree Shoe Company crime," and Sacco and Vanzetti was not in the crime, end quote, and it was signed Celestino Madeiros. The Daily Worker then veered from what we've stated before with differences in facts as it laid out how the crime actually went down according to Madeiros. Accordingly, Madeiros stated that the day of the crime began at 4 a.m. when he was picked up at his boarding house in Providence, Rhode Island by 4 Italians in an open Hudson touring car. In our previous reporting, we gave drastically different descriptions of the others involved, as well as the car, I believe. Supposedly they changed out cars in Randolph to a Buick brought by another Italian. Eyewitnesses to the post-robbery changing out of cars happened to be Thomas Pride and his sister. Madeiros and Thomas Pride ended up becoming acquainted when Madeiros went to live with James Weeks, who we mentioned already, who was now serving time, life sentence for the crime. So Madeiros went to live with Weeks and became familiar with this Thomas Pride. Apparently, the vehicle with the Italians in it and Madeiros drove from Providence, Rhode Island to Boston, Massachusetts, then back to Providence, then to South Braintree, where at least some of the guys hung out in a speakeasy for a while. New information provided stated that Madeiros identified the men by their ages. So he said 2 were between 20 and 25. One was about 40 and one was around 35. Keep in mind that Madeiros at the time was only 18. They used American aliases and switched them at will, though he later admitted that he did indeed know the 4 men's names, but just that he would never snitch. So during the robbery of the Rice and Hutchins Shoe Company, $15,000 was stolen, and it was meant to be split up at a saloon in Providence, Rhode Island the next day. However, the other 4 criminals, other than Madeiros, did not show up, so Madeiros didn't get his cut despite fulfilling what I believe was his limited role of remaining in the vehicle with a Colt automatic pistol just in case. The Daily Worker referred to the judge in the case as a capitalist judge, end quote, and it was noted that labor needed to demand another trial for Sacco and Vanzetti, along with working class justice for all. The second Daily Worker story picked up with one of Madeiros' partners in the Wrentham National Bank robbery and murder, James F. Weeks. So Weeks stated that it was well known who actually did the South Braintree Shoe Company payroll murders. The insinuation being that the underworld knew very well who did it. According to Weeks, Madeiros told him that the gang that was going to hit Rice and Hutchins Shoe Company that became the famous payroll murders was actually the Morelli or Morel gang. The Morelli gang was comprised of brothers Joseph, Mike, Pasquale, also known as Patsy, Fred, also known as Butsy, B-U-T-S-Y, and Frank, also known as, well, Frank. And some other incredible names like Bibber Barone and Gyp the Blood, G-Y-P. Incidentally, this is not the same Gyp the Blood who was associated with the Rosenthal gang from New York City 10, 15 years previous to the time period we're talking about. Weeks gave details that seemed convincing, including having been in the same roadhouse and having Celestino Madeiros reminisce about the South Braintree payroll robbery prep that the gang did there at that Roadhouse Saloon. A key point that Weeks made was that Madeiros allegedly said that Sacco and Vanzetti had plenty of money, and presumably that money would help get them out of jail. However, he stated that he would come forward if they were found guilty. According to the article, the Morelli gang was responsible, not Sacco and Vanzetti. There were more references to eyewitnesses and plenty of circumstantial evidence that made the Morelli gang appear to have been the perpetrators of the crime. The remaining daily worker stories continued emphasizing that Sacco and Vanzetti were framed, that it was actually class warfare, and that this came from a working class versus capitalist perspective. I've added links for all 5 of the articles, as they unsurprisingly focus more on Sacco and Vanzetti, not Celestino Madeiros, and they're outside of our purview here, and they're very long. The Daily Kennebec Journal took up with Celestino Madeiros getting a stay of execution until October 27th, since he was now a witness in the Sacco and Vanzetti saga. Our second main story for the September 1926 Part 2 episode spanned 5 different newspapers, including the Brownsville Herald, twice, the Cordell Dispatch out of Georgia, the Douglas Daily Dispatch out of Arizona, and the Indianapolis Times. The story was about the heist that took place in Clarksville, Texas, and saw an ambush resulting in the deaths of 2 robbers. Said robbers emerged from the Red River National Bank with a suitcase holding approximately $10,000. Law enforcement, based upon a tip, was waiting, and when the robbers reached the sidewalk, famed Texas Ranger Captain Tom Hickman lined them up and shot them with his rifle. The Sunday Brownsville Herald created a connection between the previous episode and our previous Irving, Texas robbery. A Dallas sheriff struck out for West Texas as law enforcement believed a 3rd man who'd helped the Clarksville Red River National Bank robbers on their September 9th ill-fated heist. The mystery man was also believed to have participated in the August 25th robbery of the Irving State Bank. The 2 deceased robbers were identified as A.M. Slayton and D.L. Smallwood. 3 women were arrested a couple days after the Dallas sheriff, Schuyler Marshall, began his trek west in search of the 3rd mystery man. It's possible that the 3 women suspects were the other halves of the 3 men we've noted, the 2 deceased robbers and the 3rd mystery man. The important issue is if there is a connection between this 3rd West Texas mystery man bank robber and those who robbed the Irving National Bank, quote, several weeks ago, end quote. We may have a connection between the Clarksville deceased robbers and the 3rd mystery man of West Texas. If not, the Irving National Bank was robbed twice over that period of time. Now, the October 12 Brownsville Herald ran a story, 2 alleged bank robbers in toils. The story noted that 3 men, 2 of whom were positively identified as robbers of the Irving National Bank, were in a Dallas, Texas jail. Apparently a touring car that had been used was impounded by police as well. The 2 had been arrested in Dallas on October 11th, and a 3rd was taken in Tulsa, Oklahoma at some point over the previous 2 weeks. They were taken to Irving, Texas, and were positively ID'd by bank officials and other witnesses. A few days later, one of the robbers confessed, or completed his confession to the Chief of Detectives. Chief of Detectives Gunning, which if you're going to have a name as a Chief of Detective, Gunning is pretty good. He confessed and agreed to lead police to where the loot was in the bottomland of the Trinity River. So why did he confess? 1, he was trying to prove the innocence of a relative who was another suspect and was currently being held for questioning. And 2, he claimed that he'd been double-crossed out of his share of the loot. Based on his confession, the relative was released. The very next day, the Brownsville Herald trumpeted that the search was a failure and that the confession may have actually been a hoax. The robber clarified his confession with a rather important fact. He stated that he wasn't with the two robbers when they hid the money. Based on subsequent statements, police detectives concluded that he was actually simply trying to get his brother-in-law released. Now, there's tons of details, but it appears we'll have to wait until November 1926 or beyond for better information. It seems likely that we're looking at two different robberies of the Irving National Bank. The only real question is, was the third mystery man from West Texas allegedly involved in the Clarksville Red River National Bank attempted heist also involved in the first, second, or both robberies of the Irving National Bank? And who is he? Again, plus surely more to come on Madeiros, at least as it pertains to his probably eventual execution. And we will track, hopefully, the real robbers of Rockford, North Dakota in upcoming episodes. For now, I want to thank you for spending your time with Decades of History. Until next time.
Where somebody waits for me, sugar sweet, and so is she. Bye bye, blackbird.